What women used to be able to say before the pill came along was, oh, but we can't because I don't want to get pregnant. And then as soon as contraception came along, that was no longer a sort of last line of defense. That was no longer an excuse available. In a situation where a young man and young woman on a date, she doesn't want to say, I don't want to have sex with you because I don't like you enough, or because I don't trust you, or because I'm not sufficiently attracted to you, is that feeling of suddenly basically having to have sex with men to be polite.
Hello. Welcome back to the Lila Rose podcast. Today we're going to talk about the sexual revolution, that cataclysmic event in the 50s and the 60s that changed American culture and the culture in the West in dramatic ways and had huge consequences. We're going to be talking with Louise Perry, who's a British journalist and author, about her book from last year called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. I think you're going to find this fascinating. Louise has done some amazing and very important research on all the consequences of the sexual revolution. She approaches it from a very data-driven viewpoint. And we also get into abortion at the end of the conversation. She has some different views on abortion, and I think she's evolving on her views, and she was very candid about that. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Guys, I'm really excited to share with you a skincare company that I found recently that I actually love. It's really hard for me to find skincare products that I love and want to keep using, but I found them. It's NimiSkincare.com. NimiSkincare.com first caught my eye because they are a pro-life company. Their products were beautiful, and I was seeing some really great reviews. For the last couple of months, I've been using their vitamin C cleansing scrub, I've been using their moisturizer, and I've been using their sunscreen. I have to tell you, my skin has never felt more moisturized and smoother since using Nimi Skincare. So check out NimiSkincare.com, and for 15% off your order, you can use the code Lila at checkout. That's NimiSkincare.com, and for 15% off your order, use the code Lila at checkout. All right, well, Louise Perry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
I've admired your work, your book, from afar for, I think, ever since it came out. It's been over a year since The Case Against the Sexual Revolution came out.
Yeah, a little bit over a year. So I think it was published in the States in September.
Awesome. So let's start with your background. You have a not the expected background one might think for writing the book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. So let's first hear about your background and then what inspired you to write your book.
I started out as I did anthropology at university. I also did women's studies at university. Like very much coming from a feminist sort of academic perspective, though I actually specialized in the history of women's medicine when I was at university, which was considered slightly unorthodox at the time because it's not really fashionable to think that women have biological differences from men. But anyway, we'll get on to that. And then after I left university, I worked at a rape crisis center. So I was working with young women who had experienced sexual violence. And I was also going into schools and teaching consent workshops and training volunteers and things like that. And I guess that was a very formative experience for me in the sense that it brought me up close and personal with some of the ways in which I don't think feminist theory really maps onto reality, which I ended up writing about a lot in the book. I think that, I would still describe myself as a feminist in the sense that I think that there are certain ways in which women have interests that differ from men and are sometimes in tension with men's interests. And I think that women's interests are typically underserved, particularly, I would argue in the post-sexual revolution era, where we have a new sexual culture, which is very much more geared towards male sexuality than female. Again, we can get onto that. And I guess it was during that period that I started to be much more skeptical about a lot of sort of orthodox feminist claims about sex. And then after I left that job, I worked as a journalist for a whole bunch of different newspapers and magazines in the UK and America. And I started writing this book, I guess two or 3 years ago. I actually wrote it when I was pregnant with our son, who's now 2. It's not a writing schedule I'd recommend. So I had to write at a breakneck pace. And then it came out when he was 1. So it's been quite a busy couple of years for me.
So it sounds like would you say you had an evolution of your own thought where you maybe held what would be seen as the more modern feminist ideas about men and women and about sexuality? But your book, I mean, you have chapters like, sex must be taken seriously, men and women are different. loveless sex is not empowering, consent is not enough. That chapter in particular, when I read it, I thought, well, we've been saying this for years. These are things that we've been saying. Many people, maybe with more conservative or you could say more on the right, those values. So what was the moment for you when you had this maybe realization that so much of the feminism, it sounds like you perhaps agreed with, was actually flawed, in some ways very seriously flawed?
Yeah, so I've always been a bit contrarian. I mean, I started out when I first sort of became interested in feminism. Forgive me, that's my dog in the background. There's probably someone at the door. When I first became interested in feminism, I was drawn more to radical feminism, which is a branch of feminism that's more kind of derived from Marxism, and sees men and women as biological classes, in tension with one another. There are several fundamental tenets of radical feminism that I no longer agree with. But it's interesting that radical feminists do end up reaching some of the same conclusions as conservative Christians. So, for instance, radical feminists are opposed to prostitution and opposed to pornography and opposed to surrogacy. These are some important sort of policy points on which actually there's a surprising amount of agreement. Not on abortion, obviously, but on those points, there's a lot of it's like sort of surprise sympathy. My theory as to why that is that it's not that radical feminists and conservative Christians have the same priors, really. It's that it's actually the liberal feminists or the libertarians or whatever sort of group, whatever description you want to use for that group, who are much more, who are in favor of so-called sex work, in favor of the wide availability of porn, all of this, the kind of the ones who favor a free-for-all when it comes to sexual culture. I think it's that group that actually are the weird ones, in the sense that I think that they hold to a very strange idea, which is not really shared by any other ideological group, which I describe in my book as sexual disenchantment. So this is the idea that there's nothing special about sex, there's nothing unique about sex compared with other forms of social interaction, that you can buy it, you can sell it, you can do whatever you want with it, and we should all sort of try and pretend that it's just a neutral thing. Of course, it isn't actually a neutral thing. Like, no one actually lives their lives as if sex is just like playing tennis or making coffee or doing any other kind of like social act. There's like a deep, I think, emotional and many religious people would say spiritual component to sex, which makes it unlike anything else. And I think the reason, therefore, that radical feminists and Christian conservatives end up agreeing with each other is because they both agree that sex can't be disenchanted without terrible consequences. So anyway, so I kind of started off in the radical feminist position, and then why did I become more conservative? Partly from having children. I think that happens to a lot of people. Partly, I suppose, just from having more experience of the world, more of a recognition that actually there's this line that a reader sent to me, which I've said a couple of times publicly because I just think it's a great line. He found it in a book about winemaking. So, a sort of politically neutral space in which to say a line that is actually very politically explosive, which is traditions are experiments that worked. Right now, that's not to say that all traditions are necessarily good and healthy, because sometimes material conditions can change such that they no longer fit the sort of environment that they're designed to fit. So that's one way in which traditions can end up being misaligned. But also that, sometimes traditions can be a way of dealing with a problem in a cruel way. Like when I've used this line previously, people have said, well, what are you saying that that foot binding is a good thing? Foot binding was a tradition that lasted 1,000 years, in China. Why, and I say, well, foot binding is not, I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying that it's kind or healthy or any of this, but it did serve a purpose. The purpose of foot binding was about signaling status, about controlling women, right? Which actually historically often has been in men's interests, because mate guarding is like a thing that men are evolutionarily drawn towards doing, making sure that they know that their children are their own. It's not very nice. It's not very, virtuous, but it is something that we see across human societies, men being very preoccupied with paternal certainty. Foot binding, therefore, is working in the sense that it is it's serving kind of functional purpose in the society. Now, that's not to say that all traditions are necessarily, some traditions are healthy and unhealthy. They all emerge and survive for a reason, though. And I think what we've discovered post-sexual revolution, which is, in an ideological sense, is all being about just abandoning tradition, rejecting everything of the past. That's basically the ideological project of the 1960s, is that actually some of those traditions were actually doing a pretty good job of fulfilling the functions that society need to be fulfilled. Like the example that I give in one chapter is marriage. There are some downsides of marriage. The feminists are completely right to say that if you live in a society where divorce is an impossibility, then having a tyrannical husband is a terrible outcome. I completely agree with that. That isn't to say, though, that marriage, that the old tradition of monogamous marriage, which is now more or less dead in the West, wasn't fulfilling a very, very important function, which was basically the regulation of heterosexuality, right? Heterosexual relationships are incredibly complicated. Like the coordination problems involved in mating and reproduction are so difficult, and of the very many ways that societies have come up with to deal with that coordination problem, actually monogamous marriage of the Christian model is, I think, that the model that we have, the only model that we've come up with that seems to adequately serve the interests of women and of children. Because the sort of utopian models, the throw tradition out the window and come up with something completely new models that progressives propose, have never actually managed to solve that problem. We have not successfully come up with a better alternative to monogamous marriage. Given the rates of fatherlessness among children now. I mean, in my city of London, half of children now will reach the age of 50 not living with their biological fathers.
It's incredible.
Right. And we know that there are so many adverse outcomes for children associated with that. For all of its flaws, the monogamous marriage model, like realistically, the choices that we actually face if we're looking at the anthropological record are between the monogamous marriage model and the polygynous model, right? So we have one man having multiple wives. That's actually, for most of our species history, has been the most common mating model adopted. It's also a model that has very harmful consequences for women and children in terms of that it's a model that's associated with higher rates of domestic violence and child abuse, and also all sorts of other unwanted sociological phenomena. So this is the point that I guess I've come to learn with age, that actually it's very easy to sit atop your high horse, and point out the problems with different traditions or different political systems or whatever. What's much, much harder is tearing them down and then creating something new and better. That's actually a really, really difficult thing to do. And I guess that's a sort of fundamentally conservative insight.
Well, I thought your book does a fantastic job of really outlining why the sexual revolution created such harm. Can you share a little bit more? You mentioned, some of the harm of children born to non-monogamous parents as an example. That's a problem here, by the way, in the United States too. I think it's about half as well of children will not have an intact family. They will have, whether it's remarried or boyfriend, step parents, they'll have these different kind of modern family arrangements as a consequence of the sexual revolution. What are some of the other consequences of the sexual revolution that you explore in your book?
Yeah, so I try as much as possible to be really data driven on this, because actually the data, I think, is really compelling on things like fatherlessness, for instance. I mean, like, one of the strongest arguments in favour of not bringing a step parent into the home, which normally means a stepfather, is that the presence of an unrelated male in the home is called the Cinderella effect in evolutionary psychology. It's associated with 100-fold increase in the risk of physical and sexual abuse. which is obviously not to say that all step parents are abusers. Of course, that's not true. But there isn't actually another factor that we're aware of that increases the danger as much as the presence of a step parent in the home. And I don't think people know that. I really don't think that that's a widely known fact, but the data is very clear on that. It's also very clear on the fact that fatherlessness is associated with higher rates of incarceration for boys, higher rates of teen pregnancy for girls, all sorts of unwanted outcomes, because actually fathers do perform very important socialization roles with their children. And despite valiant efforts, it's just much harder to do all of those things as a single mother, because you have to do it all by yourself. This seems obvious, but it's these are controversial things to say, though,
Our sponsor today is EveryLife. EveryLife is America's pro-life diaper company. Products that are made with the care of your little one in mind. These are high-quality, ethically sourced products that you're going to love. Diapers and wipes that you can get for your little one or your niece or your grandchild or whoever that little one is in your life. Check out everylife.com and use the code Lila10 at checkout for 10% off your order. That's everylife.com. Stop buying from companies that don't share your pro-life values, especially baby companies, and instead check out everylife.com. A sexual revolutionary might respond to you and say, well, I see the research you're pointing out. It's hard to argue with that. And so our recommendation, of course, is not to change sexual mores, necessarily. We need to still encourage freedom and exploration for adults who consent. But that is why we have contraception and abortion, to avoid children that are born in arrangements where there is not really a long-term arrangement where the child could grow up with that security. What would be your response to that?
That humans are incredibly complex creatures and human societies are even more complex. And one of the weird outcomes of the introduction of reliable contraception and decriminalised abortion has actually been a massive rise in rates of childbearing outside of wedlock, which is not what you would expect, right? You would expect that obviously when people were given the sort of technological means to control their reproduction, that they would choose not to have children in unstable situations. And that's not what we see. I mean, because I think what happened is that the introduction of contraception and abortion basically served to shred all of those traditions that I was talking about earlier, like the shotgun wedding, for instance, was basically a thing of the past by sort of the end of the 1970s. The line that I use in the book is when motherhood became a biological choice for women, fatherhood became a social choice for men, in the sense that it became much more socially acceptable for men to say, well, you chose, this is your problem, babe, right? Like, you chose to have this child, so it's on you. And also, I think that we saw an uptick in the sort of absolute amount of out-of-wedlock sex that was happening. One of the interesting recollections that you'll read or hear from women who were in their 20s when the pill came along is that they suddenly found it much more difficult to say no to sex outside of wedlock. Because previously, one of the differences between men and women psychologically, which I think is very important to understand, and which anyone who's sort of committed to a blank slate view of human nature can't understand, is that women are more agreeable than men in general. So on average, women are more willing to put the interests of other people before their own. And they struggle to sort of stand their ground when those kind of conflicts come along. And I think that's even more acute when you're dealing with also the physical differences between the sexes. So, in a situation where a young man and young woman on a date, young woman doesn't really want to have sex, she doesn't want to say, I don't want to have sex with you because I don't like you enough, or because I don't trust you, or because I'm not sufficiently attracted to you, or any of these things which, demand some disagreeableness, demand assertiveness, and also potentially risk physical, intimidation or retribution or whatever. What women used to be able to say before the pill came along was, oh, but we can't because if we risk pregnant, I don't want to get pregnant. And then as soon as contraception came along, that was no longer a sort of last line of defense. That was no longer an excuse available. And what women who experience that transition speak about and write about is that feeling of suddenly basically having to have sex with men to be polite. That suddenly becomes the sort of social expectation, which sounds so weird, but that, that's how that's how human relationships work. They are often weird. And so you ended up with, women often not like the statistics on the amount of pleasure that women actually get from these kind of casual sexual relationships are really depressing. Most women they're not actually orgasming during these encounters. They're not necessarily all that attracted to the men. It's kind of, what is often described as sexual freedom can also from another angle just be looked at as often just a sense of sort of sexual obligation almost, women having sex that they didn't really want to be having. But because contraception and abortion give the illusion of it being consequence-free, there doesn't seem to be a reason to say no. So you end up with a sort of absolute rise in the amount of extramarital sex and premarital sex that everyone's having, which then obviously leads to unwanted pregnancies and many women not having abortions for whatever reason. And so, you end up with many more children born into homes where they actually never have a father, or into relationships that are unstable because of the demise of marriage. And so they end up, it's actually in the first year, I believe, that most of these relationships break down, which is actually not surprising. If, we know how stressful it is having a baby. It's not uncommon for sleep-deprived parents to get grumpy with each other and for the relationship to fray. And if you don't have that expectation that this is for life, you can see why people would bail at moments when it felt difficult.
Or they have the abortion and they bail afterwards. I mean, because of the implications of the abortion and some of the mental health or emotional repercussions of that abortion. So either way, it's a hard, it's a bad bargain of what they're dealing with. It can be a difficult bargain for what they're dealing with afterwards. In your chapter on consent is not enough, you mentioned earlier, I think after your work with women who were victims of sexual assault and working, with rape survivors, you talk about, I think helping out at workshops to negotiate consent. It sounds like, if I understood you correctly, and I'm curious, why consent isn't enough, from your vantage point. And, what does it mean then, the work that you've done in the past about, training people on consent? Is that something that can be trained? Can you take a 17-year-old and say, these are the things that you must expect before doing the sexual act with another, 17-year-old, these are the things you must demand. What's your kind of take on that approach by some feminists and other people in culture who say that's one of the, the bright lines we have to teach young people in order to ensure a successful sexual future for them?
Yeah, so I don't think that consent workshops are a complete waste of time, but I think that they don't do what most of their proponents think they do. So I think what they do, which is useful, is they inform young people on the law. One example, obviously the law varies across countries, but in the UK, for instance, it's illegal to take photos of yourself if you're under 16 and share them, because that's technically like possession of child pornography. And indeed, sharing other images of, say, your 15-year-old girlfriend sends you these images, you're then in possession of child pornography. Like, these are the sort of like ins and outs of the law that a lot of young people aren't going to know. And so it is a good opportunity to tell them, particularly if this is, say, in a school environment, where then you can say, we've informed you of the law. If you are caught breaking this, you will be expelled or whatever. So there's some merit in just making clear the kind of institutional position on this kind of behaviour. There's also some merit in, sorry, the dog's at it again. There's also some merit in informing victims, either girls or boys who are going to be victims in the future, or who have already been victims of some kind of sexual offence. This was illegal. What was done to you? You would be within your rights to go to the authorities or to speak to a teacher or whatever. So there are things that consent workshops do that are useful. What they don't do, though, is they don't actually prevent rape, I don't think, because rape isn't a consequence of that kind of misunderstanding. Like, oh, I didn't know that was illegal. Yeah, I think that's a really implausible way of looking at the motivations behind sexual violence. Like, sexual violence actually is basically just straightforwardly sexual aggression, sexual desire combined with like aggression or lack of any kind of moral restriction. And unfortunately, it's a fact of all human societies. And it's also, by the way, it's overwhelmingly committed by young men, like really quite young, typically sort of like age 15 to 25 is actually the peak. And that makes sense when you think about the fact that that's when testosterone peaks as well. Like this isn't a very comfortable way of looking at it among feminists, where the line that's typically used, I mean, the line that I'm sure I repeated when I was working at Rape Crisis and teaching these workshops was, rape isn't about sex, it's about power. It's like a political act, is the way that feminist theory tends to understand it. And to say, well, no, actually, it's kind of it's a product of our evolutionary history. You know, like for obvious reasons, in some instances, it is evolutionarily adaptive for men to be sexually violent. That doesn't mean it's a good thing, you know, a long way from it, but it does provide an explanation and a way of understanding, you know, why, for instance, sexual violence peaks at certain ages, also why the most at-risk groups of victims tend to be young women. The modal age of a victim of rape in the UK, and this is also true elsewhere, is 15. It's surprisingly young. Again, it's because it's victims' fertility, which is what's really attractive to would-be rapists. You know, this, given these quite deep-rooted origins of this kind of crime, you can't just sit kids down for half an hour and just tell them the consent is really important and expect that to like make any real difference.
And I think the argument you have there is that what's underpinning it is lust. And you mentioned the evolutionary impulse to procreate, but I think at the very core level, it's a lust that I want to do this thing biologically, even though morally speaking, and I have free will, I should choose not to do this violent thing, but I have this impulse to do it. So you're not saying that they don't have the ability to choose not to do it. It's more that they have a strong impulse to do something wrong.
Yeah, and it's a very, very strong desire. And recalling 5 years ago when you were told at school, you know, that this was a bad idea is not likely to be very persuasive in that moment, right? I mean, like one of the things I advise parents on, for instance, is it's a really, really bad idea to leave young people alone together with alcohol. Like it wasn't that long ago that was considered to be very sort of commonsensical, but more sort of parents of more progressive politics who don't want to be too heavy-handed are likely to be much more liberal on that sort of thing. And I say, look, you know, if you're dealing with like horny young people, basically, like one of the worst things that you can do is introduce alcohol to the mix, because there's this cognitive bias in men where men will tend to overestimate the degree of sexual interest a woman has in him, right? That there might be absolutely zero sexual interest, but there's a cognitive bias in men where they will tend to see a little bit of sexual interest even when there is none. And alcohol aggravates that effect. So basically you have a young man who is probably being raised watching porn, which has addled his brain and given him completely unrealistic ideas about female desire. And he's drunk, so he's like more likely to see sexual desire in a woman where there is none. And he's also has less impulse control, so he's more likely to give in to his lust, as you say, right? Like that's like the perfect recipe for the kind of, you know, the Me Too incidents, or date rape, we might call it, whatever. So not necessarily violent rape, but nevertheless very, very distressing rape, which is actually, you know, it's impossible to collect data on this because it's just measuring sexual violence data is infamously difficult. But my guess would be that kind of sexual violence, the kind of date rape, teenager sexual violence, it's probably never been higher than it is right now. Just because we tend to be more permissive. And, you know, those kind of sexual encounters are probably not going to result in a baby because of contraception and abortion being available. And so in some sense, they seem invisible. And maybe parents...
Or they do result in a baby, but the baby is aborted, which is, you know, the whole case for abortion in cases of rape, that this is a needed thing to end the life of this baby in this tragic case.
And parents might never know that their teenage daughter has gone through this. So it seems invisible, and it seems that actually that kind of liberal hands-off parenting is fine. It doesn't have any consequences, but actually it very often does have consequences. And like the number of times, for instance, that teenage girls that I've spoken to will be raped in those kind of circumstances, and their parents will never know. It's quite common. So I think often what's going on here is that, these young women are experiencing the very damaging, distressing consequences of not having the kind of, yes, onerous, but also existing for a reason, boundaries that used to exist. And they suffer in silence very often.
What better way to start your morning than with a cup of coffee? And that's why I start my morning with 7 Weeks Coffee. 7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee brand. It is gourmet, organic, low-acid coffee that's ethically sourced, and you're going to love the different blends that are available. So check out 7weekscoffee.com. Use the code Lila at checkout for 10% off your order, and support the pro-life movement as you do it, because 7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company, and they give 10% of all their proceeds back to the pro-life movement. It's called 7 Weeks because a baby at 7 weeks is about the size of a coffee bean. You're going to love 7 Weeks Coffee. If you haven't already tried it, what are you waiting for? Go to 7weekscoffee.com, use the code Lila, check out for 10% off your order. You're going to love 7 Weeks. So what would you say, Louise, is the alternative? Obviously, on my show, we talk about chastity a lot, inside and outside of marriage. We talk about marriage being between one man and one woman, lifelong, sacrificial, loving, open to life. And, other principles that I think are seen as, say, conservative or Christian, but I think they're also profoundly reasonable. And you don't have to arrive to that conclusion of this is the most best way to live for human flourishing just from a faith perspective. You can arrive by it by looking logically at the consequences of other, deviant or sexually explorative, you could call it, behaviors. The sexual revolution's kind of prescription for this is how we should behave. What would you say is the solution? You've definitely dismantled, I think you did a great job of dismantling the sexual revolution in your book. So what is the alternative that people should, the moral foundation that people should consider and perhaps live by?
Well, the thing that I tell women, religious or not, is we can't uninvent the pill, but we could live as if it doesn't exist. You could pretend it doesn't exist, and I think generally that's a good indication of whether or not you're making good sexual decisions, right? Like, basically, I think it's a terrible idea to have sex with a man who you really, really don't want to ever be the father of your children. Mm-hmm. Like, if that's the case, then why is he worthy of your trust? Why is he worthy of your emotional investment? Why would you trust him to be alone together if he's completely not cut out to be a husband and father? Then surely that tells you something about whether or not you ought to be jumping into bed with him. So, I think that general principle is a useful one. And yeah, I mean, many of the prescriptions that I end up issuing, it's funny, I started off writing the book just thinking that it would be a kind of standard journalistic or semi-academic take on this history in politics. And then I realized when I was writing it that I did actually have to be prescriptive. I did actually have to say, what is the better alternative? And I actually ended up writing a list that every chapter contains some kind of prescription. And indeed, every chapter title contains some kind of prescription. And then the conclusion, I end up sort of summarizing it. And yes, a lot of it is, frankly, a lot of it is just incredibly basic. It's stuff that's considered to be commonsensical in every era but ours, which is why my last chapter is called Listen to Your Mother, because I think actually... like basically any mum could tell you this. Not
your feminist mother, though. Right. Well, it depends on, maybe it's your grandmother or your great grandmother.
Maybe it's your grandmother.
It depends on who she is. But
but any woman who's sort of spent enough time in the world to have accumulated some common sense can basically give you exactly the advice that I offer.
But it's interesting. I mean, even what you said earlier, which I completely agree with. I think I've said this on in many ways on many different platforms. Don't sleep with a man that who not only you wouldn't want to be the father of your children, but who isn't already committed to you for life. Because I mean, what you were saying earlier, if this man is not someone you'd want to be a husband or a father, why would you sleep with them? Well, it's one thing to want them to be a husband and a father, but if they haven't committed that to you, that they that they are willing to go the path of, I'm going to be your husband and I'm going to be a man who would be a father and seek being a good father, then even if you're sleeping with someone, a young girl who says, oh, I think he'd make a great husband and father, he's not committed.
Yeah.
So you get pregnant, that doesn't secure you or your child in any way. So it forces the issue. It forces the issue of not just, is he good enough to marry, but are you married?
It's funny. One of my best friends when I was at school, her mum always used to tell us the words of wisdom, which I now find myself reproducing, and we used to roll our eyes and think crazy. But like one of the things that she used to recommend, for instance, is that if you're dating a man, and you're both like of age and serious about marriage, and etc., if he hasn't proposed to you within the first 6 months of a relationship, you should break up with him. And we always thought, that's crazy. Like, what, you like this man so much, you want to marry him, and therefore you're going to break up with other. But now I think, oh no, I understand the reasoning. The reasoning is, if he's not willing to make that demonstration of commitment, he's not going to. And that tells you something actually about how he regards the relationship. And investing in it further is very likely to waste your time. So all of these
maybe
old
12 months, maybe give him 12 months.
But
I think that the principle there is a good one, because I mean, how many women are cohabitating or waiting around years and years, sometimes a decade of their life, and they're saying there's still no formal commitment. There's still no, not just a promise, I love you, but I promise before the whole world, I love you and I'm committed to you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's essentially what marriage is, isn't it? It's just making a formal declaration, and if you're not willing to do that, it's not a very good sign.
Yeah, which is again the whole trope of, well, marriage is just between you and one person. It's private. Why does the law have to get involved? I would say, well, it's involved because you could create children, and then the state has an interest, and then most importantly, this is a community effort to encourage your unity and your promise, and that you are an exclusive unit. But there's one other thing I wanted to get into. I know you've got to go in a few minutes here, Louise, and it's some of the commentary on abortion. Obviously, as you know, I head up Live Action, and I'm keenly interested in what I see as maybe a progression of thought that you have on this. You had an article now out recently on basically on abortion, and you quoted a poem from the Scottish poet Holly McNish, and he says, he said they'd found a brothel on the dig he did last night. I asked him how they know, he sighed. A pit of baby's bones, a pit of newborn baby's bones was how to spot a brothel. The article, of course, is about the sexual revolution's consequence of so much abortion. I mean, really billions of abortions globally since the 60s. And in the United States, it's over 60 million. So I'd love to hear from you, your position on abortion and how has it been affected at all by the research that you've done over the last few years, and also the response that you've received to your book.
So I used that poem as the epigraph actually for my book, and then repeated it in that the essay I wrote for First Things, which was called We Are Repaganizing. The argument that I make in that article, I didn't actually write a great deal about abortion in the book itself, but it's obviously very central to this whole question of sexual revolution, is that, my legal position, in all honesty, is safe, legal and rare. I think that safe, legal and rare is quite a good principle. But
do you think that's possible, though? I mean, based on the reality of, we have abortion very legal. They argue that it's very safe, but it's not ever rare.
I mean, this goes back, doesn't it, to the dismantling of all of the laws and norms that compose the old sexual culture, where we had various things in place, like fragile, complex social systems to try and basically minimize the risk of anyone getting pregnant outside of wedlock. And those have all just been thrown out the window by the technological innovation of the pill, really, and trying to reconstruct them is very hard. And I suppose the thing I worry about is that if you were to ban abortion in its entirety, you wouldn't see those old systems resurrected overnight, because that's hard to do. You know, there's a line from Roger Scruton, I think the British philosopher, that beautiful things are easily destroyed but hard to make. I think that's the line. I'm probably mangling it. I think that also applies to social norms. Trying to resurrect those overnight would be really difficult. It might happen over time, but the thing that I fear about criminalizing abortion, and the reason I'm kind of agnostic on this question, is that it would be like what happened in Romania under Ceausescu, where you ended up with state orphanages filled with unwanted children. So I think that all of the options here are difficult and tragic. I mean, the point that I make in the First Things article, though, is that I think that the Christian prohibition on abortion is really quite unusual historically. Most cultures, most religious traditions are more permissive on abortion than Christianity is. And I think that's because there's this very central moral principle within Christianity, which is the protection of the weak and the vulnerable, which is really unique. And
the uplifting of women too, and I think you make that case as well.
Yeah, no, I think I think the reason that early converts to Christianity were overwhelmingly women was because it was a far, far superior system, particularly of sexual ethics, than the Roman pagan system, which was deeply misogynist and also very tolerant of abortion and infanticide. And I think that the problem, therefore, for feminists who want to, I am not one of these feminists who says an abortion is just like getting a tooth removed. It's morally meaningless. I don't believe that. A vast majority of voters also don't believe that. That's a very sort of eccentric position to take. But the feminists who want to take that position and say that abortion is morally meaningless, I argue that they're kind of soaring at the branch on which they sit, in the sense that the whole feminist idea that women are just as morally valuable as men are is not something that all cultures or religious traditions agree on.
Right.
Like, far from it. It's actually really quite unique to the Christian view of the world because of this Christian uplifting of the vulnerable and the weak. And women are vulnerable and weak compared to men, just on a physical sense. Like, we have half as much upper body strength as men do. Like, in a straightforward competition of strength, women lose. So to say, okay, well, we're throwing this whole idea out the window that vulnerability and weakness and whatever are worthy of special protection, I think not only, there are all sorts of reasons why that's not welcome, but one of them is that actually I think that the whole moral argument for feminism depends on that idea. And I think that trying, therefore, to reject Christianity, reject the moral ideas that are derived from 2,000 years of Christian tradition in the Anglosphere, is to risk undermining that very valuable principle.
And here's the question, though: I wouldn't just say it's a risk of rejecting Christianity and the principle of valuing the vulnerable, but it's really valuing reality. As you've made the case in your book, sex is meaningful. To pretend that it's not is to deny reality. And similarly, I would argue, human life is meaningful, and to pretend or deny its reality or its meaningfulness is another form of living in an alternate universe and in La La Land. And so, when someone is pregnant, I think you would probably agree with this, they are pregnant with a human life. And I think that's the underpinning of the pro-life argument. It's not so much about we want to, take away women's rights or, criminalize something because we just love using the law as a cudgel, but more that if these are human lives and human lives have a right to live, that right to life, then they deserve equal protection under the law as does anyone else. What's your take on that?
Well, hey, women are more pro-life than men are, right? And mothers are more pro-life, because I think that, anyone who's been pregnant knows that it's not a trivial thing, and that, a miscarriage is far more upsetting than is not getting pregnant one. Like, everyone knows that there is a very meaningful difference, even from conception. But also the sorry fact is that abortion and infanticide has been a fact across every human culture that we know of.
But in the West, it was criminalized and looked down on, as was premarital sex, and
because of Christianity,
not premarital sex being criminalized. But yeah. I think and the reason that Christianity had for that, it wasn't just, this is a God sent a message from heaven, don't have abortions. It was the logical conclusion of if human beings are very special and they're equal in the eyes of God, and their lives are equally of value, then that would extend to the most youngest and vulnerable, as well as to the strongest and the most in power.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Christian prohibition on abortion and infanticide, which I mean, I'm using them in the same breath because most cultures do basically see them as being kind of contiguous acts, is it's I think, as I wrote in the First Things piece, like it's difficult to follow. It demands sacrifice, it demands difficulty, but then that is also it's supposed to be difficult to be a good Christian. It's not the fact that it's difficult is not an argument against it within that worldview.
Well, I think a lot of morality can be difficult, right? And to your point about culture, if the culture is kind of broken, the morality is harder if people aren't raised with it. But, it can be hard to not misuse people sexually, other people. It can be hard to treat your children kindly, It can be hard to be monogamous. These things, all of morality has that hard element, you could argue. But it, as you've made such a beautiful case of it, Louise, it leads to what is really flourishing in the end. Like, this is the better path for men and for women. So I'm just curious, exploring, your view on abortion, because it seems the principles underlying your case against the sexual revolution, I think you could use those same principles for a case against, which has been, I think, the worst fruit of the sexual revolution, which is the rampant kill rate, of the sexual revolution with abortion.
You're not the first to call me out on this and to try and press me on it.
Well, I appreciate you you sharing your thoughts, and I would encourage everyone listening to consider your book. It's really fantastic. You've done a wonderful job with it, Louise. And any final thoughts just about the reaction that people have had to your book, and anything that you maybe have changed on since the book came out over a year ago?
The reaction has been so much more positive than I thought. That's been my main takeaway. It's been like 98% positive. And I get, I don't know, at least an email a day from someone saying this book has transformed my life, which I really wasn't expecting when I wrote it. Honestly, it seemed to me as if it was quite obvious. But I guess that says something about the culture in which we find ourselves, that saying seemingly obvious things can be quite radical. I guess it shows how far we've strayed.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for joining the podcast, Louise.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Lila Rose podcast with Louise Perry. I hope we'll have her on again. I felt like that conversation could have gone way longer, and maybe we'll do it again in the future. As always, don't forget to leave a review, give us 5 stars if you're on podcast app, and don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.